Hello, my name is Father Max Behna, and I'm the pastor at St. Margaret Marian Parish in Naperville. It's great to be with you for the second episode of this season of Be Formed. The section that we're going to be covering is called the Moral Law. We're looking at paragraphs 1949 through 1986. And before we get into the paragraphs and the teaching of the Catechism today, I'm going to take a few steps to sort of build up a bit of context. And the reason for that is some things, in order to be appreciated, really do need context. Let me give an example. Suppose you have a very healthy heart. You're aware of that, you've never had issues. You go to a doctor's appointment for a routine checkup. The doctor looks at your heart and he says, I have good news. You have a very healthy heart. It would certainly be good news, but it probably wouldn't be that striking or that earth-shattering. But now suppose that you've been having all kinds of issues, high blood pressure, heart palpitations, and it turns out that you have heart failure. What would it be like to go to the doctor appointment at that point and hear those words from the doctor, I have good news. Your heart is perfectly healthy. Like that would be incredible. You would probably be overcome with joy. So the same phrase, but we see how important context is in order to really appreciate a certain series of news. So what we're going to do today is first, we're going to take a step back and be reminded of what is the entire goal of the moral life. What's the purpose? What's the ultimate end of morality? And then what we're going to do from there is we're going to analyze the history of how the moral life and the church's understanding of moral life has developed throughout the church. And it's a really fascinating history that will help us to understand what the church means when we talk about the moral life and what the church doesn't mean. From there, that'll set us up with a very meaningful context in order to understand this section and really appreciate it in a deeper way. We're going to look at the different types of law that are laid out in this section of the Catechism. And my hope is that it's going to offer a very fresh perspective for us, that our understanding of law will become more meaningful, more relevant to our lives, and that it will also give ever greater context and be more meaningful for when you explore the Ten Commandments and go through that section of the Catechism later in the season. So with that, let's begin with the whole purpose of the moral life in the very first place. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a story. It involves a friend of mine from seminary. His name is Nathan, and Nathan is from the Archdiocese of Denver. I remember him sharing one day with me an experience that he had while he was in his senior year of high school. He was part of his parish youth group, and he recounted at one point how they went for a ski trip in the mountains, and on their way to the ski resort, they stopped at a coffee shop in Boulder, Colorado, pick up some coffee. While they were there, the teens were interacting and waiting for their coffee. A complete stranger came up to them and asked them a question that kind of caught them off guard. The stranger goes, hey, are you guys Christian? And Nathan, he remembered kind of being a little bit surprised of how did he know? I mean, they weren't wearing any shirts that might give that away. They looked like typical high school students waiting for their coffee. And so he says to the individual, he says, well, yes, we are, but how did you know? And the gentleman responded simply saying, because you're happy. And for Nathan, that was deeply moving, because he realized here they were just gathering in a coffee shop, and he presumed that they were Christian because they appeared to be happy. They appeared to have joy. What if I were to tell you, my friends, that the entire goal, the very purpose of the moral life was happiness. It's an amazing thing to think about, but that's exactly what the church teaches. The church teaches that the goal, the purpose of the moral life is to enter into what the church calls beatitude. Now, when we talk about beatitude, there's a very specific understanding of what we mean by that. It comes from the Latin word beatus, which means blessed. But this is a kind of a state that transcends any sort of surface level feeling that we might typically think of when we think of happy. This is happiness with a capital H. When the church talks about beatitude, we're talking about the deepest fulfillment of our deepest desires. And all of that is found when our lives are ordered to God, the Blessed Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is what He's created us for. And what's amazing is that we can start to experience beatitude in this life. And of course, it reaches perfection in the life to come. So that is the goal. That is the very purpose of the moral life. And I think that's very important for us to have as context, especially when we start talking about law. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Father Max, that's pretty astonishing. And it sounds very different than what I think most Catholics think of when we talk about morality or law or rules. Like is this really what the church teaches? And the good news is, the amazing news is that yes, this is what we're all about. But we didn't get there overnight. And so I want to take a little bit of time to share the astonishing history regarding how the church's understanding of morality developed throughout the ages. We'll be able to see what we mean when we talk about morality and the moral life and what we don't mean, which will again create a very helpful stage for really understanding law as described in the church in these paragraphs. So where do we begin? Well, obviously it begins with Jesus. It begins with, if we want to point out somewhere in Scripture where we can start to draw our understanding of the moral life, how to live as Christians, we begin with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, and we really see it as a masterpiece when it comes to understanding the moral life for us Christians and Catholics. And of course, within that corpus of teaching, you have the Beatitudes, which lead this Sermon on the Mount, and really we see it as the apex, the pinnacle of our understanding of the moral life. It can be found and summarized in those 8 Beatitudes, which Jesus leads with. Of course, in addition to actually verbally teaching how to live as Christians and as Catholics, as human beings, Jesus also witnessed it by his own example, his own way of life. And this, of course, made a profound impression on the apostles, who would later on pass on his teachings, not just by word of mouth, but through writing. And those writings would eventually become part of the New Testament. Well, as these teachings are handed down, as this way of life is passed on from generation to generation, you start to have certain figures, almost all of them saints, who were exceptional at really processing and understanding and developing our proper understanding of the moral life as handed on to us by Jesus and the apostles. And these figures we call church fathers. They were brilliant minds in the church. They knew Scripture inside and out. They studied it extensively. They memorized entire sections of the Bible and really internalized the verbal teachings of the apostles, which the church calls the oral tradition. This all included the moral life, how to live as Christians, as Catholics, and that would continue to be developed throughout the centuries by the church fathers. Fast forward to the 13th century, and we encounter one of the most brilliant minds in the church, and that is St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas was a Dominican priest who studied extensively the church fathers. In fact, he is famous for integrating and synthesizing the teachings of the church fathers, and then add that to his own prayer, his own reflection and study. And when it comes to the moral life, Thomas Aquinas produces an incredible series of teachings and understanding of the moral life, which is truly and properly Catholic. Listen to some of these elements when it comes to morality. It's really amazing. For one, Thomas emphasizes virtue in the moral life, emphasizing virtues such as prudence or temperance, justice, emphasizing things like faith and hope, and above all, love. Right? We see these habits or dispositions which lead us to choosing the good in all kinds of situations. That's what we call virtue. That is very much emphasized in his writings. We see an emphasis on grace, which is paramount for understanding morality from a truly Christian or Catholic view, right? Recognizing that the moral life, the way to live, is not imposed onto us externally, but comes from within, comes from God's grace, who transforms us and allows us to be able to choose the good, even despite our frailty and our weakness and fallenness. We see an emphasis on grace. We see an emphasis on freedom when it comes to morality. So oftentimes when we think of rules or laws or moral living, we think of freedom being constrained or restricted. But for Thomas and the church fathers, and really a proper Christian or Catholic understanding of the moral life, we actually see the moral life leading to greater freedom, true freedom, which is, St. John Paul II would say, not the ability to do whatever we want, but the ability and the capacity to be able to do what we ought. That's real freedom. Consider, for instance, the golfer. I love golf analogies. Still working on my golf game. Pray for me there. But when you look at a professional golfer, and figures like Bishop Barron will use this analogy a lot, you see that their mechanics, their movement in the golf swing, it's dominated by a series of laws. They had to be very meticulous and relentless in training their body and their muscles to conform to certain laws to allow them to hit the golf ball in the proper way. And over time, we see a freedom begin to emerge. If you look at the professionals, they're so free when they hit and swing the golf club. Well, that's the kind of freedom we're talking about when we're talking about the moral life. It leads to our true freedom as human persons, when we have the capacity to choose the good in any circumstance. That's truly freeing. We see that emphasized in Thomas Aquinas' writings. We see that the moral life is inseparable from the spiritual life for Thomas Aquinas and the Church Fathers. Meaning, whenever we practice a morally good action, perhaps that is being patient to a spouse or a son or daughter, maybe it's serving somebody in need, or trying to exercise hope in the midst of a temptation to fall into despair. Whenever we exercise a morally good action, for Thomas Aquinas and for the Church Fathers, we are actually participating in the very life of God. Like the Blessed Trinity dwells in our hearts and our souls in a deeper way, right? Because by choosing the good, we are in some sense choosing God, who is the supreme good. And so you see this oneness, this integration of the spiritual life and the moral life. They're like two sides to one coin, right? And that leads to perhaps one of the greatest emphasis in Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the moral life, and that is the focus on happiness and should be no surprise, the very goal of the moral life, as we stated earlier. And that's because the moral life is rooted in God, who is the author and the supreme source of our happiness. We see this theme dominate the writings of Thomas Aquinas. So the question is, okay, if that's the case, well, what happened? Because all of that, Father Max, sounds very different than what we typically think of when we think of morality. We think typically in our contemporary age, we think of things like morality restricting our freedom. We see it as perhaps a heavy yoke, a burden, something that inhibits our flourishing, something that's totally separate from our spiritual life. So what happened? Well, that's what we're going to explore next. Let's go to the next century, the 14th century. In this time, there arose a theologian named William of Ockham. And fortunately for Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham took up an opposing approach to our understanding of the moral life. For Ockham, the focus was all about God's will. No doubt there's a certain measure of merit or good intention to that. We might say that Ockham took it to an extreme. Why is an action morally good for Ockham? Well, because God says so. It's all about his will. Why is murder wrong for William of Ockham? Well, because God says so. And theoretically, if God wanted to change that, if he wanted to make murder okay, according to Ockham, then all he has to do is will it, and all of a sudden it's a good thing. Again, keep in mind, totally opposed to the understanding, to the morality of Thomas Aquinas, who would emphasize that actions that are good because they're rooted in God. They're rooted in objective goodness, right? Well, unfortunately, this mentality, this teaching from Ockham would really take a hold on the church, and many other theologians would be influenced by his writings and his teachings. And over time, we see a system begin to develop when it comes to the church's understanding of morality. And we might best summarize that system as one of mere moral obligation. That is, why should we do anything good? Why should we avoid evil? Well, because it's all about God's will. We're obligated to, whether that's good for us or not. God wills it, therefore we got to do it, basically. And so morality turns into a series, tragically, of do's and don'ts. And as time continues to go on, we see a sort of a separation begin to happen between the spiritual life and the moral life. And it continues to break down as the centuries go on. And this would become a very significant, really a major challenge, if not crisis, for the Catholic Church that would last 800 years. Of course, there were certain theologians along the way who would try to fix the system, who would try to deter us from this overly focused system on do's and don'ts, on pure obligation. We think of saints or theologians like St. Alphonsus Liguori, who arose in the 18th century and attempted to fix a system, didn't quite do it. Fast forward to the Second Vatican Council. Again, it's been 800 years since Thomas Aquinas. The council had its aim to renew all aspects of the church's life, which included the moral life. What happened is that at the council, at a certain point, a Polish cardinal who had a very influential, very substantial role in the council documents, he proposed something radical. He proposed something that had been done for centuries. What did he propose? To go back to the teachings of Thomas Aquinas and to bring that back into the full breadth of the church's teaching. Thanks be to God, and perhaps no doubt influenced by the Holy Spirit, this was widely received among the council fathers. And that's exactly what happened after Vatican II. There was a return to a proper understanding of the moral life as taught by Thomas Aquinas. That is, a theology of happiness, of grace, emphasis on virtue once again, and a proper understanding of freedom. By the way, who was that Polish cardinal that led this substantial shift that finally fixed this 800-year crisis in the church when it comes to morality and understanding the moral life? Pope John Paul II. His name Karol Wojtyła. It's been 60 years since the council, and what's astonishing is that fortunately, it seems that for most Catholics, we're still operating in that mindset of mere obligation, of do's and don'ts. But what's so helpful for us to really grasp and internalize as Catholics is that for us, again, when it comes to the way to live, the best way to live, the moral life, we're all about choosing the good and choosing that which leads to our flourishing, freedom, and happiness. And that is the proper context that will allow us to appreciate the church's teaching on law, which we're going to enter into now. Now we're going to enter into the paragraphs of the catechism that were assigned for today. So the focus is the moral law. And I think it's important to note the very purpose. What's the purpose of law? Well, it's to order us to the good. Of course, there's different types of law, but that's what they all have in common. They're intended to order us in our actions to choosing that which is good. Good for us, good for others, good for society, and ultimately in a way that glorifies God. And so law is actually a good thing, right? Because when we choose the good, we're choosing God. When we choose God, we are embracing our vocation, our call to beatitude, supreme happiness. And so how amazing is that? To see law not as something that obstructs, that inhibits our flourishing, but rather as something that precisely leads to our flourishing. As St. Irenaeus of Lyon once said, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. Right? That's the kind of mindset we need when we approach law. It's all about helping us to choose the good, which leads to our flourishing. The first law that the church spells out is called the eternal law. Now, this isn't really a series of laws per se. When the church speaks about the eternal law, what the church is meaning here is simply the fact that all law originally is rooted in God. Right? He's the supreme lawgiver. And that's because, again, what we've been emphasizing over and over again is that he's the supreme good. Right? No God, no law. There's nothing for law to be fundamentally and objectively rooted in. So that's important to see when we look at these different types of law, to recognize that none of it should ever be separated from God. Right? None of the laws from the Old Testament or the New, there's no civil laws or ecclesiastical laws should be separated from God. It's all meant to be ordered in Him, and He is the one that ultimately allows us to believe any sort of law in the very first place. From there, we have what's called natural law. The church spells out in a few paragraphs in this section what natural law is all about. See it this way. The best way to understand it is natural law is that system of right versus wrong, good versus evil, which can be intuited and grasped through the light of reason. In other words, this isn't a revealed law per se. This is something that is wired into the very fabric of our beings. This is something that can be known by any human being in any time, in any region or culture or civilization. These are universal truths. Let's take an example. For instance, knowing that it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. We don't need a government to tell us that that's true. We don't even really need the Bible to tell us that that's true. We can know it simply through what we call natural law, or knowing that it's wrong to cheat on one's spouse. Not necessarily written down anywhere per se in society, but we all know that that's a simple, basic truth. Note, if you look at paragraph 1956, again, these laws are universal. They're true for every human being. So the benefit of that is simply the fact that this unites us and serves as a sort of basic, fundamental and foundational layer when it comes to law. But there are challenges. There are sort of limitations when it comes to natural law. For instance, some laws aren't able to be known very clearly through the light of reason. We can think of a couple examples. The duty to worship God regularly. Not very clear through the light of natural reason. We know it can be intuited through reason, but not always obvious. Or the understanding, the truth that marriage, authentic marriage, is between a husband and a wife, right? Sometimes not very clear, just based on the light of reason, especially if cultural norms or societies are promoting a contrary message. And then another challenge when it comes to natural laws, well, sometimes we're really good at tricking ourselves. We can be really good at justifying our actions. For instance, it's possible that somebody could justify stealing from another individual. Maybe they say, well, I've been out of luck for a long time. I'm going to do it just this once. I really need this. Really good at rationalizing. And that, therefore, if we're just limited to natural law, we're not going to be able to embrace the fullness of how to live. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be more challenging to see that clearly. And paragraph 1960 of the Catechism really seems to summarize that. The Church says, the precepts of natural law are not perceived by everyone clearly and immediately. In the present situation, sinful man needs grace and revelation, so moral and religious truths may be known by everyone with facility, with firm certainty, with no admixture of error. The natural law provides revealed law and grace with a foundation prepared by God and in accordance with the work of the Spirit. So, do we see the gift of revealed law? At a certain point in time, God chooses to spell things out more clearly. And that's so helpful for us, right? Especially if we see law as something that leads to our good, our flourishing, our happiness. This is a great gift. And that leads to what we call the old law. When it comes to the old law, basically we mean that moment when God chooses to reveal himself to a people. He chooses to reveal to them not only who he is, but also how to live. And that is essentially summarized in the Old Testament. We see this revelation given by God. We see the law and the prophets and God choosing Israel and forming a people and leading and guiding them, teaching them how to live. And of course, that is most greatly summarized, this old law summarized in the Ten Commandments, which will be studied more diligently later on in the season. This is a great gift. It's important to keep in mind, again, left to natural law, we're missing something as human beings. So God, in his love and his generosity, he chooses to begin to form them in a type of law which will reveal how to live. But again, there is a challenge here. There's just one issue. Go to paragraph 1963. According to Christian tradition, The law is holy, spiritual, and good. Speaking of the old law here, yet still imperfect. Like a tutor, it shows what must be done, but does not of itself give the strength, the grace of the Spirit to fulfill it. So this is something that St. Paul will really begin to emphasize in his writings. He explains the law, it's good, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It tells us what to do, tells us what not to do, but we need something more. We believe as Christians that we're part of a fallen race. We're wounded. And we need God's grace to heal and to transform and to enable us to actually live the fullness of God's plan for humanity when it comes to how to best live. And that is what leads to the new law. The new law which is rooted in Jesus Christ. Of course, this is the law of the gospel. And with this revelation from Jesus, we see law come to a perfection. We see that he doesn't abolish the old, but rather fulfills it, brings it to perfection. But what's more than that, he also offers grace. Thanks to his passion, death, and resurrection, he's won for us the ability to actually live out morally good actions, even in difficult situations, not because of our efforts or energy per se, but because of his grace, which of course we cooperate with. And so those are the fundamental laws. Of course, the Catechism talks about civil law. When we think that, we think laws that are put forth by cities, by counties, states, and countries. And then ecclesiastical law, which is the law of the church. Ecclesiastical has its root in ecclesiae, which is our understanding of church. So these are laws such as liturgical laws, what are the proper norms for how we pray, how we worship as Catholics, but also canon law, how the church is operated and governed. And I'm going to stop there lest I bore you to death with canon law. To conclude today, we've focused on the moral law. We've just highlighted the different types of law, beginning with the eternal law, as well as the natural law and its relationship to the old law, to the new law, and the other types of law, civil and ecclesiastical. But of course, we looked at these laws through the context, through the lens of how the church developed its understanding of the moral life, how to properly live. And at the end of the day, we were reminded that it's all about beatitude. That's the goal, that's the purpose of the moral life. And that is what law directs us to. That's what helps guide us to. And therefore, law is not something that restricts our freedom, that takes away from our flourishing, but rather elevates it and helps to order us to the good. Not just a good in any situation, but the good who we call God. And so, if you are interested in learning more about the church's understanding of the moral life, I'm going to leave us with two resources. One is called Morality, the Catholic View by Servais Pinckaers. It's an excellent book, perhaps one of the greatest books we have that sort of summarizes that history of the moral life that I'd spoken about earlier in the talk. And then we can't exclude one of the great encyclicals by Pope John Paul II, who, as a reminder, helped to really bring the church back to a proper understanding of the moral life as laid out by the Lord and the apostles and the church fathers. And that encyclical is called Veritatis Splendor. Veritatis Splendor. So my takeaway, brothers and sisters, is again, it's going to sound like the same message over and over again, but I can't emphasize enough that when it comes to the moral life, it's not about do's and don'ts. It's not about mere obligation. It's about the best way to live that leads us to God and subsequently brings about our greatest freedom, and our greatest happiness. Hopefully, this gives the proper context for continuing to understand the moral life as you continue in the season, as well as when you come to the Ten Commandments. May God bless you and keep you and help you, give you the grace to embrace eternal beatitude.